Well, I'm Harry Burns, and at present I'm Professor of Global Public Health at the Strathclyde Institute of Global Public Health here in Glasgow, having previously been Chief Medical Officer for Scotland.
Harry, you've spent a career focusing on improving the well-being of the people of Scotland, and I would like to explore that in our conversation just now. So I wonder if we could perhaps begin by just asking a bit about where you grew up, and are there any memories that you have of particularly important points in growing up which were important to you?
Well, I grew up in Scotland, spent some years in the east of Scotland, but mainly grew up and was educated in the west of Scotland. I don't think there are any significant events that I could look back on. I think the one thing that marked my early childhood from discussions with my parents was the fact that I was an intensely curious child. I used to drive them nuts by constantly asking, but why? I just wanted to find out why the world is as it is, what made it work or not work. And found my way into medicine. It wasn't my first choice of career. I wanted to be a pilot because I was really taken by the way aeroplanes worked. But that, I was told my eyesight wasn't good enough and so on. So I ended up in medicine because it sounded like a kind of interesting thing. I mean, I suppose my life's journey has been why things are as they are and how could we make them better. And doing that from a very scientific viewpoint. And I guess where I've got to now is a view that the world is a complex system. We have tried to fix it with a 19th century mental model of the machine. Pull a lever here, you'll get a result over there. Complex systems don't work that way. And therefore we have to adopt different methods for making small changes across the complexity of society that will add up to a big sea change. I've never classified myself by my job. I don't classify myself at all really, but I think of myself as someone who wants to know why, or maybe wants to know why not. And so it seemed a very natural thing to do, and I've never had a second's regret. Well, maybe 1 second's regret. I remember about a year after I gave up surgery, watching a programme. I tend to avoid medical programmes like the plague, but I happened to see a programme in which someone was demonstrating an operation, and I thought, I had quite a lot of skill at that, and I'll never exercise that skill again. And within a minute I thought, yeah, fine, we've moved on from that. So, yeah, I've never regretted to move into public health.
And in those years, focusing on public health broadly, what sustained you?
What really made it interesting was the fact that I could see that conventional thinking in public health was narrow. It was all about behaviours. People are ill because of the behaviours they choose to make, and it was perfectly plain to me from my experience of Glasgow that people in the East End were less able to make choices about their lives, that what had happened in their lives had effectively robbed them of the sense of self-efficacy and control that more affluent people who were in jobs who had a bit of resource behind them, both financial resource and community resource, if you like. They had networks of friends, work colleagues and so on that would help them in difficulties and so on. Whereas many of the people I had to deal with were isolated within themselves, living in threatening circumstances with poverty and And the question I began to ask at that time was, okay, we've got all these people dying of heart disease, but actually what they're dying of is poverty, bad housing, and so on. What's the link? How does being at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale cause heart disease and cancer? And so I set about piecing that together, in part with the early work I'd done when I was a surgeon around some of the biochemistry of that we saw, but pulling together pieces of work from all sorts of disciplines that produced a kind of coherent analysis that is, I think, now broadly accepted. Well, it is, because lots of folk have now done this, that shows that your experience in early life lays down a pattern of biological change that increases risk of mental health problems at school, in childhood, failure at school, exclusion from school, exclusion from the workplace, increases the risk of alcohol and drug abuse, increases the risk of going to prison, and increases the risk of premature death. And we know the biology behind that in great detail. The way in which genes become switched on or off influences your possibility that you become addicted, or the way in which your brain has developed when you've been living in neglectful circumstances increases your risk of inappropriate behaviour, increases risk of violent behaviour, and so on. The solutions to that are not medical, they're not biological, the solutions are social. Stop it happening. What sustained me as Chief Medical Officer was the ability to get in about that kind of programme. And again, I was fortunate in having great people to work with. People who looked at what I was doing and gave me space to pursue an idea. And that idea is growing legs. It's now, from discovering things like improvement science, which fits with my ideas that the world is a complex system. Improvement science emerges from the way in which you change complex systems. Suddenly we've got a method for improvement in all of this. And I think it's been great to be at the birth of that sort of movement in Scotland.